All right, so I'm going to talk about some of the research I did in Alaska that I'm doing for my PhD. I'm sorry, for my postdoc. So I'm going to talk about dendrochronology and climate change in Alaska and how the climate is really changing the forests on a large national scale. So you can see here, this is Alaska. This is where it's really warm during the summer. That's the Yukon Flats. This is the Yukon Flats. Fairbanks is like right here. This is the fires that we've had in Alaska in the past 60 years. Look how much of material Alaska's burned in 60 years. In 2004, I believe 4 million acres burned in one single year. So what I think is really neat about dendrochronology and looking at the climate impact is it addresses all these issues of scale. You can have trees with 400 rings or 400-year-old trees. You have 400 pieces of data. So this is a quote from Tom Putnam and Peter Brown, and they're two really well-respected, well-acknowledged biologists, ecologists, really forest ecologists. And I think they did a really good job of pointing out, like, we often miss the issue of scale, of size, and temporal scale. So with trees, I can have a 400-year-old tree. I can have data of climate going back 400 years. And then in my study, we collected trees over most of the Yukon River in Alaska. So we have a huge time temporal scale and a huge spatial scale. I wanted to really quickly talk about dendrochronology. And I don't know if you can read it too well, but this is University of Arizona, and it says tree ring research was invented here. And it really was. It was A.E. Douglas who was the first person who was like, oh my gosh, these tree rings have a signal. And that signal tells us about the climate during that year.
Sorry, Tom, I just had to share the screen. So
No problem. So I'm just oblivious. I'm just talking. I got a pointer. So, I haven't used a laser pointer in a long time. So this is called the Floodplain signal. And it was kind of like the beginning of dendrochronology, where they said, oh, we can really like do research on this. And it opened up those temporal scales because 400-year-old trees, or in the Southwest, you can have really old trees. There's some reconstructions of climate based on tree rings that go back thousands of years now. So it's pretty unique and pretty powerful stuff. I wanted to really quickly just show some tree rings, or at least kind of a caricature cartoon of it. So each of these rings here is an annual growth. When you have a fat ring like that, what do you think that means?
A lot of growth.
A lot of growth, but why?
Moisture.
Moisture?
Temperature.
Moisture, temperature, competition, environment, it's all those things smushed together. How many trees were above it, shading it? Was it too warm? Was it too dry? So in Alaska in 2004 and 2005, I think a total of almost 9 million acres burned in those 2 years. And you can see these two rings right here. They're tiny. So temperature is a huge driving factor of tree growth, especially in arid systems. The Southwest is very arid and hot. Alaska is just cold with not a lot of moisture. So there's a short growing season and then not a lot of moisture when you need to grow. So that's what we look for with dendrochronology. We look for wide or narrow rings, and that tells us a little bit about the climate. But we also have to take that into the big picture of there's other things affecting it. So if this was a tree that was in the subcanopy, it's being shaded. So it might be being outcompeted for light or water. So there's a lot of things you look at, but the temperature and the precipitation are really important factors. So I've worked for Glenn today for my postdoc, and he's a forest ecologist who just retired from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And we worked on by Sagebrush, a white spruce. I found this really cute little white spruce photo. And what we did, we also worked with Claire Elliott, and this is a really good team. I was really fortunate to have really good collaborators to work with. She's an archaeologist who works with all types of wood. So she reconstructs where people lived in the history based on wood finding. She's reported some areas in far northwestern Alaska where people were living, I think, 1,300 years ago, based on wood samples from their early houses. So the three of us worked together on this project to figure out how floodplain white spruce are impacted by climate. And the reason why we use floodplain trees is, if you think about a floodplain, it has the same ecological processes. It has flooding, it has primary disturbance like that, and then it's fairly flat. So you don't get aspect topography, and those things are huge factors for tree growth. You can look at the mountains, you can often tell what trees are going to have by aspects of elevation and slope. So we worked on the floodplain because between eastern Alaska and western Alaska, there's only 400 meters elevation change. There's almost 1,000 standardize a lot of those variables by saying we're going to study the floodplain. But in dendrochronology, that was really kind of controversial. Can we study floodplain trees? A lot of times people use trees that are at tree line because they catch the signal. They're the ones that are on the edge of the forest. So first we had to prove in previous articles by Glenn and Claire that you could use floodplain trees to reconstruct climate or to look at climate. So this is Alaska. What do you think some of these white, or I'm sorry, pink and blue areas are? Glaciers, where would you find glaciers? Yeah, so this is Denali. This is Denali right here, just over 20,000 feet. Highest point on the continent. Fairbanks is right here, 400 feet. So almost 20,000 feet elevation change in just over 100 miles. This is Wrangell St. Elias, 18,000 foot peaks. Up here, I don't know if you can see the dot very well. So I could go up there, but the screen's way too big. So the way up top, that's the Brooks Range. So this is Yukon Flats. It's a large flat area. And that's the Yukon River starts all the way down here in British Columbia. It's through the Yukon Territories, up through Yukon Flats, all the way down to western Alaska. And what we did is we looked at tree growth and how it relates to climate from this area by Fort Yukon all the way to the western tree line. So it's a pretty big study. And I thought I should first of all justify, or at least explain a little about climate in Alaska. This is the seasonal, like warm season temperature, so basically the summer temperature, for 100 years from the first order weather station. So 100 years of data from the best weather stations you can get. This is at the Fairbanks Airport, and it's daily measurements that we consolidated into mean. You can see it's gone from a mean of 9 degrees Celsius to a mean of almost 11 degrees Celsius in 100 years. There's a lot of variability there. The climate and all these processes are very, very variable. But some pretty substantial change. And that's kind of the underlying basis for this talk. If it's getting warmer, what's going to happen to the forest? So there's a lot of climate research around the world. And Alaska is definitely a hotspot for it. So I didn't want to go through a bunch of papers. So I chose one paper that I think does a really good job of summarizing climate change impacts and climate warming in Alaska. And it's called Evidence and Implications of Recent Climate Change in Northern Alaska and Other Arctic Regions. It has a bunch of well-known, really highly respected scientists. And basically, they went through a hit list of 22 things and said, weather, what do you know about weather? It's warming. What do you know about carbon? What do you know about glaciers? Most of them are receding, not all, but most. What do you know about snowpack, ice caps, rivers, lakes, tree line? Birds, caribou. Lots of bird studies in northern slope of Alaska on the Brooks Range. And then, of course, humans. And they went through and just really said, here's the evidence, here's what we know about climate change. And so there's a lot of information out there and a lot of knowledge about how a warming climate is affecting the boreal forest. So this is the Yukon River Basin. It's one of the larger river basins by area in North America. It starts in British Columbia, comes through here, and all the way. And we're going to be studying the Yukon River in Alaska, and then also the Tanana River, which is a tributary into the Yukon. Tanana River on its own right is a huge river. And so again, we just sampled in the floodplain to try and use that as sort of a control. So there's less variability in our samples. We didn't have different aspects because most of the floodplains are pretty flat. We didn't have steep slopes, and we have a fairly small elevation gradient between here and all the way over here. So it was a really neat way to frame the study. So this is a map of Alaska with all the green being forest cover. And then the dots are everywhere we sampled. And we have 36 samples, about 540 trees that we could use for the data. We have many more than that, but we have to call some out for certain reasons. And so we sampled a lot of places, and this is all done by river trips, pretty much. You get in the circle and you float down the river, stop and sample. One time we took a power boat from Fairbanks down to Canada, up the Yukon, and then back. Power boats are really slow when you're going up a river. So it took like a week to go like a couple hundred miles. So this is a quick summary of the project. 540 trees. Some people say that's a lot of trees. If you've counted every ring on that tree, or actually 3 or 4 times you've counted radii of that one tree, it's a lot of things to count, a lot of data to collect. We standardized the data or determined it. 5 minutes? Oh no. So one of the main points is we correlated to 3 different weather stations. We have the Fairbanks weather station, the Graph, and the Bethel. The idea is like, we have our sites way down here, we can't really relate them to there. So we use multiple weather stations to look at the change. We had a lot of trees. I wanted to just show, is that blacking out? So this is a distribution of our tree age. Most of them are 120 to 140 years old. And that's probably because there were so many steamships going up the rivers that area to get people to the gold mines in 1850s through 1900, early 1900s. So a lot of our trees are that age. We have a couple trees that are 400, 300 years old. I'm going to try and go a little faster because I don't have a lot of time. And the gist of this whole study is that you have some trees that respond positively to a warming climate, and you have some that respond negatively. And in general, a lot of people said that warm climate trees are going to grow better, but there's limitations. So it depends on how much water they have. So we have a positive response is you got increased tree ring growth for that year with increased temperature. The negative response would be decreased growth with increased temperature. And then the big aspect that we found, the big part is it's different regionally based in Alaska. So we took these individual trees and we said they're either positive or negative responders, and then we took each of those 36 sites and said they either respond positively or negatively or mixed. And what we found is a little over 50% of our sites and their trees responded negatively to climate, and then about a third responded positively to climate. And then we broke it down into sites, and so most of our stands were negative responders with a few stands that were positive responders. Any guesses on how that works spatially? Where are the positive and where are the negative responders? It was related to the color coding of the dots on the map. What's that? Not elevation. Coastal versus inland. That first map I showed you, that temperature map, shows inland Alaska. Interior Alaska is very warm and dry. Western Alaska is cold and wet. The problem in Western Alaska is it was too cold most year for the trees to grow. So as it warms, they have a longer growing season and there's plenty of water. So those Western Alaska trees are over here on this conceptual diagram. This is the idea that increased temperature on the x-axis, increased growth. As for some trees, as it warms up, they have plenty of water, they respond positively to temperature. That's Western Alaska. Eastern Alaska, as it warms up and gets warmer, they go into drought stress. Too high temperatures, not enough water. So you've got trees in Western Alaska doing better, you've got trees in Eastern Alaska or Central, Interior Alaska doing worse because they've reached their physiological threshold. It's too warm without enough water. They could probably do it if they got more water, but they have a longer growing season that's warmer, but the same amount of water more or less. So they did worse. So what we did is broke this down. This is the Bethel weather station, and these are the positive responding trees. And the open circles are pre-1950 data. The closed symbols are after 1950. So there's been a shift in time from pre-1950, things got warmer and the trees did better, higher growth rates. And then this is negative responders. You can see that the more recent trees, the post-1950, they've done worse. And then again, at the Fairbanks weather station, the trees have done worse over time. So we've documented some trees doing better in recent years as it's gotten warmer, and some trees doing worse. And so we have negative responders. This is a pretty common graph in dendrochronology. It's got the tree ring growth here, which is a standardized measure. It's basically units of standard deviation. And you can see that the positive responders after like 1976 start really doing better. The negative responders after 1976 do a lot worse. A lot of people call that a regime shift. They think there was a large global change in climate right around the mid-1970s. And so we could document the tree growth being much worse for the negative responders and much better for the positive responders. And that's what this map shows. All these red dots are areas where the trees are doing worse, negative responding. The yellow dots are mixed response. We can't really say for sure at the stand level or forest level that they're doing better or worse. And then Western Alaska, for the most part, are blue dots, and they're probably a little hard to see. And so these trees are doing better. So we can expect some pretty large scale changes in the forest structure of Alaska on a massive scale, with this area drying out, a lot of disease, a lot of drought, a lot of insect outbreaks, and a lot of fires here, whereas these trees are doing better. Is your time?
Yes.
All right, I'm almost done. So you got positive and negative responders. What's next? So for Alaska, we've got increased fire, with scale and severity and frequency of fire. We've got tree health issues with tons of insect outbreaks in Alaska. It's pretty crazy, the amount there. You've got kind of big picture, a threshold or a tipping point being reached where we're seeing a biome shift, where what was once white spruce forest may not be white spruce forest ever again, or at least in the relatively near future. And that's because of this temperature-induced drought stress. There's a lot more information here on these topics. I just kind of was putting in the main ones I just know, the main papers I was from. You can't see this really well, but this area right here is all brown, and this is some NDVI data. And the idea is that this area, this central interior Alaska, is really drying up. And so a lot of things that are white spruce forests in the future will probably be asking for us and never go through that successional progression into white spruce if we pass those physiological thresholds for white spruce growth. So we'll have probably more aspen, more shrublands. There's actually some hillsides in central interior Alaska that are sagebrush land, which is pretty bizarre to see, like dry sage on a soft basin hillside. A lot of people say that will expand, and that's really related to drought, fire, past disease. So we're looking at a large-scale biome shift of interior forests, which we're talking hundreds, tens to 100 million acres. Quickly, any questions?
Yeah, we have a couple minutes for questions. How long did this research take?
I was involved for 3 years, and I should say this paper was actually is in review in forest ecology management right now. The data was collected from 2001 through 2012. I think there were 4 to 5 years of sampling. So, and the data processing for dendrochronology ground is pretty tedious because you're literally measuring every ring of a tree, and you usually do it multiple times. So we overall, Claire, Alex, and Glenn, they were working on it for over 10 years, and I've been working on it for over 3 years.
And it's still going or no?
It's in review for publication, so hopefully it'll stop. Just kidding. John?
Can you explain how you maybe tease out some of those other factors that you mentioned at the beginning associated with
As far as competition?
competition, like well, you talked about topography with the elevation gradient, but were there other ones that you had to?
Temperature and precipitation are main drivers. There's abiotic factors really affecting biotic growth. A lot of times you're averaging at stand level or you're consolidating, and so you're hoping that this thing will kind of fall out with the major factors driving. We can't like remove all those factors, but we standardize the data and that helps a little bit. That's just kind of putting it all into standard deviation. So we can look at a slow growing tree versus a fast growing tree. We can still tease out the climate signal from those, even though if the fast growing tree wasn't a bigger range, the slow growing tree, they're still related to that climate signal. So that's an overarching signal, it's just kind of cleaning it up. So a lot of that's due to standardization of the data. And then a lot of it, and this is a debatable subject, is the site selection and the tree selection. So, and that's why this project is controversial because it's a floodplain. A lot of people, traditional dendrochronologists, say, I'm just going to go for this one perfect tree, the biggest tree in sight, that's right on the edge of the forest, right at tree line. And so we were not as selective because we wanted to, we didn't want to take that kind of, we wanted to get a bigger signal in there, but we also tried to control for those changes like sampling the cycle. So that was a big part of it. But there was a previous paper by Claire and Glenn that had proved that you could get a climate signal from floodplain white spruce. One more question?
Were you only looking at live trees or did you take any?
We sometimes took dead trees, but we had to cross-stake those to figure out when they died. So we had to match those tree ring signals, wide, narrow, wide, with living trees so we could place those dead trees in time. So we often use live trees, and we did cores, but we also cut down live trees and took discs, so we'd take like a cookie slice of them. Because from that disc, we could take, that's an 11-year-old disc up top. We could get really good data, because you can sample anywhere around that tree, there's a good tree ring, that you can see it, that you can measure it, whereas with cores that they did before.
Round of applause. Our next speaker is Dr. Coote.
Let's go ahead and get started because I only have
10 minutes to talk here. If I get 15 to talk, then I got 5 for questions? Okay.
And you can push it for 20.
All right. I'm pushing it right now. I'm starting to eat up Anna's time. So this is, you can't really see it. Sorry about the terrible projection, but that's Gunnison Basin. That's a picture of a sagebrush ecosystem here. And I should just warn you, this project is, don't expect to see like a lot of results. This is a work in progress, but I thought it'd be interesting for you to see sort of,
If I turn off all the lights, is that gonna be terrible?
yeah, it'll be pretty dark. I'm okay if you guys are okay.
All right.
You don't need to take notes. Anyways, it's just a work in progress we're working on right now, so I thought it might be interesting for you guys to see those sort of the evolution of a scientific project, or see one that's at sort of that a little more, you know, at its maybe midpoint or something like that. So, damn it, there goes like a precious minute.
All right, John.
All right, so we'll try and do this for real here. Okay, yeah, the imagery is really not looking very good here, but
Another minute.
you can see here, this green here, that's sagebrush ecosystems of the Gunnison Basin. It's pretty much a defining feature of the basin. That's a DEM of the basin here, kind of sliced out. And at these lower elevations in the basin, as you know, there's a lot of sagebrush, critical habitat for Gunnison sage grouse, big game winter range, and also, you know, it's part of our economics with livestock use in the summer, particularly as the stock growers are moving their cattle from, you know, winter pastures up to the higher mountain pastures where they spend the summer. A lot of people probably don't know this, but the sagebrush habitats in the Gunnison Basin are far from homogeneous. There's sort of 5 key different types. The black sagebrush type, Artemisia nova, and you'll see these weird codes here throughout. That's just how they're coded, and this is kind of a naming convention. Wyoming big sagebrush, Artemisia tridentate wyomingensis, sort of at the lower elevations of the big sagebrush range. Hybrid sagebrush, nobody really knows. It's probably a hybrid between wyomingensis and Basiana, and it's just called Arter2 because it's Artemisia tridentate. As you get up a little higher towards Crescent, you can see the mountain big sagebrush, Artemisia tridentate Basiana. Apparently this one is tetraploid and this one is diploid. So what this hybrid is, I actually will have a student working on that, trying to get a little handle on that this spring. Snowfield big sagebrush is a higher elevation, smaller plant, Tridentate spiciformis. That's what we think we have. All right. Some concerns about sagebrush in the basin. Typical concerns with sagebrush habitats, invasive plant species like cheatgrass. What this image is supposed to show is a big patch of hennycress, which is kind of like this weird mustard that seemed to be like really abundant this year and kind of looks like it's on the threshold of kind of being an invasive species. Perennial concerns about effects of livestock, big game, you know, are they overusing their winter range, etc. And then drought and climate change. And what you can't see in this picture either is a lot of sagebrush dieback that we're anecdotally think is due to the drought 2002. All right. So, you know, one of the big picture issues here is potential for climate change to push this system into, you know, I think Tom really did a great job sort of leading up to that. And maybe Alaska is the future habitat of sagebrush. So, you know, we have our, here's our current climate in Gunnison, mean annual temperature 38 Fahrenheit, mean annual precipitation about 10 inches. This is some climate modeling done by MTI's Robin Wall. Some of you guys might have found this talk here earlier in the fall, but basically here's what we've seen in terms of temperature change so far in, let's see, yeah, in Colorado right there about 2010. Here's where we're headed, and here's 3 different scenarios that MTI's mapped out. The hot, dry scenario has about 5 degrees Fahrenheit, decreases precipitation by 10% by 2035, which is just around the corner. So I was interested in, like, what does that really mean? I found a current modern analog for the future climate of Gunnison, Sagebrush, Colorado, and mean annual temperature of 43. And under here it says mean annual precipitation of 8.5 degrees, 8.5 inches of precip. And this is a picture from the area around Sagebrush. You'll see there's no sagebrush in that picture. So that doesn't necessarily mean anything. but it's kind of interesting in that the place that is most closely looks like what Gunnison may look like is definitely sagebrush-free habitat. In the 1990s, about 1,000 transects were sampled across all the habitat types in the Gunnison Basin using this kind of complicated protocol, and it resulted in this publication's ecological types of the upper Gunnison Basin. There's two main kinds of transects, line intercepts, and then these microplots. Some of you guys may have experimented with some of these sampling techniques. So this seemed like a rich source of historical data that can be followed up on to track changes. We also have this other great tool, NDVI, that Tom also alluded to, which is basically a measure, a remotely sensed measure of plant productivity. If NDVI is high, that means there's a lot of photosynthesis. Plants absorb red, but they reflect lots of near-infrared. If photosynthesis is low, you get a lot of, you get more absorption of near-infrared and more reflectance of red. So that's what NDVI is. So these are the tools we took which we would take advantage of for this study. Okay, let's see here. Here are our objectives. Basically, you want to see, are there changes in sagebrush habitats in the Gunnison Basin? Can we test for relationships and establish relationships between any patterns of change? We know we kind of have some idea there will be some changes linked to climate variation or other causes like winter concentration areas where elk and deer can spend a lot of time. There's our Colorado temperature trend there. Here's our recent this is Palmer Drought Severity Index. You can see since about 1990, there's been some pretty extreme droughts, and also temperature has gone up, so that's probably not news to anyone. And lastly, we wanted to explore linkages between field measures of vegetation and remote sensing. See if we could kind of extrapolate out changes over a larger landscape, or maybe see, well, is decreasing NDVI, is it actually, can we say on this particular site, are we seeing decreases in NDVI from outer space that we can then link up with, hey, we lost sagebrush to this site, or lost grass cover. So that's the general idea with this project. So our methods are comprised of a field remeasurement effort. We got about 106 of these transects remeasured during last summer, which is pretty good distribution across the basin. There's thousands of them out there, but unfortunately, about 1,000 of them out there. Some of them, they're all different habitat types. Some of them are not of interest for this particular study, and then some of them, there's no photos of where the transect was. There's hard copies of the original data. So it was kind of like finding the transects that we could actually use for this project. We needed to be able to go out there and relocate that piece of rebar at that site. So we had this cool magnetic wand locator thing. It sounds like an electric guitar. Like when it starts to get close to the rebar, it starts getting really excited. We have nice photos of the original site. So we go out there and kind of line it up. Okay, where are we? We need to stand so that mountain is right like that relative to that mountain. And then it was really cool because you'd be out there looking, like, yeah, there's a rebar right there. So it's kind of like a, really sophisticated Easter egg hunt. So it's really fun. Except it could be also deeply frustrating. You're like, God damn it, I know I'm right. Where? They're like, oh look, it's buried underneath my feet. So it was pretty fun. All right. I don't know what that was. So I thought I'd just kind of present the findings so far and sort of what did we learn from the field remeasurements so far, and then we'll look at the NDVI data. And this is where the talk starts to run into the fact that I'm still doing a lot of these analyses. This is not very effective scientific communication. I just copied and pasted some results onto a slide. I could have made a nice figure to visually illustrate these trends, but we found significant declines in live, I just did this last night, so I didn't have time for that. Significant declines in live shrub canopy cover from 42% cover to 34% cover. So imagine you're out there in the landscape, nearly, 4/10 of that landscape was occupied by live shrub canopy cover. In the 1990s, it's down to 34% today. And dead shrub canopy cover went up from 9.3 to 16%. Hey, a corresponding 7% increase. So hey, those numbers line out really well, and we can say, oh, those shrubs probably died, which is good to know. They weren't eaten by something; they died, right? Which is a different type of cause than the shrub is gone. All right. Good thing I only have about 3 minutes of data left. So, what have you learned? If we add up all the sagebrush cover, pretty much similar trend. The sagebrush is what's driving this trend, but it's interesting that other shrubs exhibited the same trend of loss of flat cover. Sagebrush decreased from 29.4 to 23%, also highly significant. You know, I don't know if you guys know about the paired t-test. If that's in your statistical box of tools, it's the most awesome, easy test ever used. And this is like one of those few instances where you can actually use a paired t-test. So it's really fun. You can do this in Excel. So rabbit brush showed a marginally significant increase, which is kind of interesting because that's kind of what we'd expect as we lose sagebrush to being rabbit brush. Chrysothamus, there's also a bunch of species that are super hard to tell apart. Are they really different species or not? You know, it's just like sagebrush. Sagebrush, you know, it's interesting. It's like a miniature tree in a sunflower family, and it sort of redefined what species really are because they kind of smear together. All right. Microplot data with all the interesting stuff covered by blue grama grass, Indian rice grass, you know, random different rock cresses. I don't know, we haven't analyzed those data yet. Those are going to be a lot harder to analyze. Should be interesting though. Okay, just to show you guys some pictures. If someone hit the lights just for the next 3 slides, thank you. Because it's kind of cool to actually see, and you know, you can't see without it. All right. So you can actually kind of see some of the differences, and this is where it gets really fun, you know, and this is why it's fun finding that, hey, this rebar is right there. Hey, look at this tree, it's hardly changed at all in 20 years. But here's an example of, this is site 944011, in case any of you guys are familiar with this location. That's Blue Mesa in the background. Hey, look, Blue Mesa is a little bit lower in 2014 than 1994. So, maybe it's just a different time in the summer, but no, we actually measured these sites within like 2 weeks of their original sampling, you know, date as far as calendar date. So you can kind of see this, but this site, a lot of sagebrush was lost. This is a Wyoming instance sagebrush site, sort of at that lower elevation. All right, this is a Ardor 2 hybrid sagebrush site, so no one really knows if it's Wyoming instance or Basiana. Same deal. You know, one thing we notice a lot, and I should have brought some pictures to illustrate this, but a lot of times these little patches of forest right on the edge of the sagebrush, like if you look at the photos, you're like, man, a bunch of those trees died. This one only looks to have lost like maybe 1 or 2 trees. Anyways, you can really see the sagebrush die back here. You can see all these carcasses of dead sagebrush. And you can see this bright green here, up here, right there, see? And this one over here, those are rabbit brushes that are kind of coming in and filling in some of that space, it looks, compared to this really dense, healthy sagebrush here in 1995. This is a Basiana site, so we're up at a higher elevation. This looks like it's probably up in Taylor Park. And same deal, same pattern. Nice cover by sagebrush here. You can really see, you know, every, you know, 5th sagebrush has died in the last 20 years in this recent photo. So I was going to make some other comment. Oh yeah, look, you can see the glaciers have been melting. You see that? I'm just kidding. All right. So, all right. So here's our second. So what's going on? There's a lot still to analyze with all that, an incredible amount. I don't know how I'm ever going to get to it all. But then we've also tackled this. Let's get some satellite imagery, some climate data. So we've got the assembled a time series of June to September, Landsat NDVI grids. Some of those, there's a bunch of holes in those records. You know, it was too cloudy on June of 1992 or whatever, so we don't have good data from that month. And then we've got 4-kilometer resolution data, and which values all these climate and remotely sensed data are extracted for all of our sample points. And just to show you a couple trends here, this is kind of cool. From June through September, you can really see NDVI, you can really see differences between the different sagebrush types. So like here's Wyoming Ensis at that lower elevation. You can see it hardly gets green at all then, but it doesn't change too much. Up at the high elevation, here's the spiciformis. It's way greener anyways. It really has much more of a pronounced seasonal peak, but you can see that greenness really started to decline by September. So I want to get some May data too. But you can really see those different sites. There's black sagebrush, there's that hybrid, and here's that Basiana. So that's just interesting seasonal trend. And then, okay, here's that time series over all those years. Okay, it just looks like a bunch of garbage when you try and actually look at the different types. But if you just look at, okay, you kind of have to squint your eyes a little bit, but if you just look at the average values for all the sites, our NDVI time series, you can see this really pronounced trend from, you know, low, peaking up here sort of in the mid-90s, decreasing again. That's 2002 right there, even though that was sort of a banner dry year right there. And then going back up, and this is, these data, we've got June, July, August, September, all on here. So what I want to do is kind of condense those into like a single like summer NDVI value, so you can really see that. There's a lot of variance, but you can see that increase here, decrease. Going back up, you know that 2007-8 was this big wet winter, and yeah, lo and behold, 2008 was really green. And guess what? This is this is 2012 to 2013. So 2013 super dry, or 2012 super dry, and then 2013 increasing a little bit. So we can really see those trends in NDVI. Here's precipitation. We can see it's linked to that. I haven't really started exploring the temperature data yet, but I expect to see some interesting linkages there. All right, lots to do. Test for changes in cover, composition, richness, microplots. Look for the relationships between NDVI and cover composition. So like at every single site, what does the satellite tell us how it's done over the years? Where is it now compared to where it was? Characterize those relationships, hopefully. And I'm interested in this climate water deficit, which is another measure that we can use with some topographic data and the PRISM data. See if we can actually figure out, did drought kill these sagebrush? Which we think it did, but then we can extrapolate that across the whole basin, and we can have forecasts and future changes. So that's where we're at. Lots of acknowledgments, lots of great funding, and good research crews out there. A lot of people like, well, I'd rather go study, high elevation alpine wildflowers or something. But Sagebrush Habitats are really beautiful. Being out there on a nice June day, it's gorgeous. There's tons of cool plants out there. It's actually, really enjoyable ecosystem to work in. And, but yeah, do you have any questions? Do you have time for questions? Couple minutes. I was trying to talk really fast. Can you tell? All right. No questions at all? Oh, all right, sorry. I just couldn't see.
So if there's not sagebrush in to watch, what is there?
What's there is this thing called, there's some rabbit brush, different species. Well, it's the same species we have here, but not one of our really abundant species. There's this thing called winter fat that's everywhere down there. It's Crashinocobia lanata or something, like you change the name of it. There's blue grama. There's there's kind of little pinyon and juniper scattered in the hills. It's very dry, there's no sagebrush. So, yeah.
So, were you guys using the same cameras and then trying to get
No. We just use like whatever cameras on our phones is here. So, but we're not comparing, we're not actually analyzing those photos just to say, hey, here, look, so you can see the difference, right? I mean, the Landsat satellites have the same, once they launch that thing into space, that's the same camera. So, well, I'm kind of lying a little bit too. There's actually Landsat 5 and Landsat 7, but anyways. Any other questions? All right.
Round of applause. Okay. So we've got the plants covered. I'm going to cover some bird research I've been involved with. So this is going to be northern Minnesota mostly. This is research with, these are a bunch of my collaborators from the Natural Resources Research Institute at the University of Minnesota Duluth. So this project is one of the largest systematic data, includes the largest systematic data set of breeding bird population trends. So this data set spans over 20 years, but I'm going to show you the last 2 decades, which is interesting because these two have both talked about the last 20 years as well. Northern forests are considered to be sources for many species of birds. Northern forests being mainly the boreal forests, sources being where they are sourced from to fill sinks. So the northern forests are considered sources for sinks in the rest of the Midwest. Bird population trends tend to be early warning systems. They're literally the canary in the coal mine when we look at different ecological conditions. And I'm going to talk, there's a lot of different ecological conditions that you can gather from bird trend data, but I'm going to focus on climate. So these are our study areas. The green is the Superior National Forest. The orangish brown is the Chippewa National Forest in northern Minnesota. And we also have the Snoqualmie and Imagery National Forest in northern Wisconsin. But this data is from the 2 Minnesota National Forests, the Superior and the Chip. The Superior National Forest is Boreal Forest. It sits right on the edge of the Boreal Forest of Canada and Alaska. Sometimes in the southern part it's considered hemi-boreal forest. The Chippewa National Forest is more hemi-boreal and hard and softwood forests. So our protocol is that it's different than most bird protocols in that we actually place random points within a habitat patch. So we seek out different habitats, and this data has gone back to 1995. So since 1995, we've gone to the exact same points in those habitat patches doing bird surveys in the summer. We have 3 point counts per habitat type. A point count is where you just stand there, and I don't know if you can see this because of the lights, but this is what it looks like. In the Boreal Forest, you have a head net on, you have gloves on, not because of cold, but because of insects. You have boots up to here because you're walking around in the bog. It's very wet, lots of insects, and that's why the birds love it. So stand there for 10 minutes, and you mostly hear the birds around you. Sometimes you do see them, and you record all the birds you see here within those 10 minutes. So we have, in those 2 national forests, 329 stands, so 3 points in each stand or habitat type. Over 950 points are surveyed every year. The surveys are during the breeding season, so that's from June to the first week of July. And then what makes this study different than other bird studies, not only is it a large data set, but we also, every single surveyor has to go through a hearing test and also go through an identification test of both birds by sight and sound. And then we have a 3-day field camp where we all go to the Boreal and make sure that we are consistent in our data collection. So, just a sampling summary. So since this is the period from 1991 on, but you can see how many sites we sampled, the total number of samples. And I think some of the numbers to pay attention to are, doesn't show very well, does it? Over 21,000 samples in this time period that we're analyzing. We have recorded over 168 species and over 330,000 different observations of actual birds going into this data set. So, now I'm getting into the results. The 2 lines on the bottom are the 2 national forests, the Superior and the Chip. The green line are the total number of birds combining those 2 national forests. And this is over time since 1995. So you can see in any given year we can record between 10,000 and 20,000 birds during the summer. Some trends. So interestingly, what I think a lot of people don't expect is that overall we're seeing both in population trends for birds, either they're stable or they're increasing. And so the green depicts the percent of birds that we analyze that are actually stable in the population, meaning there's no significant change in increase or decrease. Blue represents how many are increasing, but the red represents how many are decreasing. So in this data set, in Chippewa National Forest, we have over 20 years, 7 bird species are decreasing. Superior, a little bit different. We have more decreasing and more increasing. And then this is the regional, so both those national forests together. So again, we have 8 decreasing species, 17 increasing, and 20 that are stable. So just an example of what the data actually looks like. So each of those lines is the mean over time, or mean over space, and then you can see that the top graph are the Chippewa National Forest, the middle Superior National Forest, and the bottom is the regional. So this is the black and white warbler on the left. It's been increasing over the last 2 decades, and you can kind of see it's an easy way to see that increase, right? It's very compact and smooth. The Ovenbird is a little bit of a different case. If we were to just look at the last 10 years, it actually seems like it's decreasing, and there are people looking at this. And why that is actually invasive earthworms might be a reason because of ground nesters. We can talk about that later. But the fishermen actually release worms. Never release worms if you're using merchant fishing. They're not native. And they decrease cover. Anyway, that's a tangent. So, but over time, in the last 20 years, in general, ovenbirds have been increasing if you look at the data set as a whole. One interesting thing is that in almost all of the national forests, even in Wisconsin, that we looked at, permanent resident species have found increases in population number. These are like chickadees, nuthatches, many of the woodpecker species. So these are birds that overwinter in the boreal forest in northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin. Huge increases, and I'll get to why we think that is right now. And these are the species that we're seeing in decline. So the species that we have in decline over the last 20 years span a wide range of different habitats. And in the parentheses, you'll see a negative sign, a plus sign, and a little like squiggle mark. So one of the other largest data sets for birds is called the Breeding Birds Survey. And it's a citizen science survey that takes place in the US and Canada, and people do surveys alongside roads. And the reason why we show this is because a lot of analysis on population trends in birds is based on that data. And we are actually finding in our systematic study that some of the trends that we are seeing are not the same that Breeding Bird Survey is seeing. For example, we are finding that common loons are actually in a large decrease, but Breeding Bird Survey shows that they're increasing. Yellow-bellied flycatcher and downy woodpecker, we're finding they're decreasing dramatically, which is really interesting, especially for the downy woodpecker. But Breeding Bird Survey is showing that they're stable. So there's some inconsistency there, and we're working with some of the ENVS folks in the northern part of the U.S. trying to figure out what's going on with different techniques, and it's probably detectability issues with citizen science. So you can see it spans the board. Another interesting thing is that most of the lowland coniferous species, like Alaskan flycatcher, species, thrush, yellow-bellied flycatcher, and specifically Connecticut warbler, we are seeing drastic decreases in these birds. So these are birds that are specific to, sorry, no, that's okay. These are birds that are specific to conifer forests. And when I say low conifer forest, think boggy, really thick, like spruce, super buggy. A lot of these birds are nesting either on the ground or towards the ground, and they gather most of their insects in that spatial area towards the ground. Connecticut warbler is a bird that we've seen that 80% of this population decline in the last 20 years, which is slightly scary. And all of these are migrants as well. New declines, basically these are declines that are happening in the past 5 years. And what's disconcerting about this is both of these species are considered to be common. So chipping sparrows are birds we have in the backyard. Mourning warblers these are both migratory, short distance migrants, long distance migrants. Mourning warblers are birds that are pretty adapted to different kind of habitats, but are also in decline here. And I'm going to touch on that why we think that is happening. Okay, so some explanations for these trends. There's a lot of different things that go into why birds are either increasing or decreasing, right? We've talked about modeling. So for birds in this area, as far as breeding, a lot of habitat disturbance, and the main type of disturbance is logging, and exogen development. We also have climate change issues. And then, of course, a lot of these birds are migratory, so hazards that are happening during their migration or where they're overwintering as well. So here's what's happening, at least in the national forest during the breeding season. The graph on the left is harvest levels from 1990 on. So as you can see, harvest levels in all 4 of the national forests have been decreasing. This is mainly because we've been implementing best practices, especially in riparian areas. There's a lot of riparian areas in the national forests, and selective logging. And we think that's one reason why ovenbirds may be increasing in general. I mean, the earthworm thing is another thing of why they might be decreasing alongside that. Because ovenbirds are birds that live in mature-ish forests. And so we're seeing a lot of early successional forests actually decreasing in this national forest because of selective logging. Another explanation for trends, so a major increase in the permanent resident species, and we think this is because of 3 different reasons. One, they're being supplementally fed during the winter, because these are birds that are overwintering. But we're finding now that actually the 2 main reasons why we think the permanent resident species are increasing is because winters are less severe, we have less snow cover, they're warmer, and these are birds that are trying to survive winter. And we have insects emerging in the northern forest up to 2 weeks earlier than they normally would be. And so these birds are already there, they're able to nest 2 weeks earlier, start nesting, they have more broods than they would in the past, like 20 years ago. And so we think that's why their numbers are actually increasing. So that's all climate related. So So another explanation for some trends, if you notice, like the graph is dipping point. Each of this is the total number of birds. Each of those arrows points to a year where we had a spring that was incredibly cold. We had like an April, May snowfall, and then huge rain events. And where this comes into play especially, so here's one of the birds that are recently decreasing in our northern. We thought was a species that's pretty adaptable. It's very, there's a lot of them out there, but they are a new decrease, and this is a ground nesting bird. So if you consider that we have these huge rain events, this bird is reliant on building nests on the ground, and it's wet and cold. We've seen a gradual decline in the numbers, probably because of those extreme events. On the other end of the spectrum, so we've had these extreme rain or snow events during the early breeding season. But in general, Minnesota is heating up just like everywhere else. We have been on the drought forecast. We always focus on California, but Minnesota has also been one of the top places for drought in the last especially 5 years. And so in these, this is that lowland coniferous forest. You can't see it very well, but it's very red. There's water interspersed in there. It's very thick. Those were those 4 or 5 species of birds that are in major decline. Birds that tend to nest here down on the ground. That's where they're getting their food as well. These places are shifting. They're drier. There's less insects emergent, and these birds are relying on that wet habitat to survive. And that's why we think all of those bird species are in decline right now, just because of the drought in Minnesota. So those are how they're kind of climate related. And then right now, there's a big push on the Chippewa National Forest to take both temperature climate data, the harvest data, a lot of the, this might be Landsat data, so like shifts in forest composition and our bird data, and start making a better picture of what's actually happening in those northern forests. And that's that. I stayed well within.
You get the prize. Okay.
So any questions about, I kind of cruised through that.
So a lot of those birds like migrate to go from one place to another.
Yeah.
Is it useful at all, or can we all look at the places they migrate to and see like what the changes are in those places, so you have double stress? Or?
So, yes. I mean, so no and yes. So there's a new field called migratory connectivity, which with the idea that we focus on breeding grounds here because we have birds here that can breed and then they leave, right? And then there was a push probably 10 years ago to start focusing on wintering grounds, like, oh, maybe we should pay attention to this. And there totally is stuff happening on wintering grounds. And just in the past, like the migration stuff that I've been working on since doing this, that's literally like the last 5 years, like, oh, maybe we need to start considering the hazards during migration. And so this sort of data is being plugged into migratory connectivity models, but the data on wintering grounds and during migration is just starting to like come up. And so the answer is we're just starting to get to that. The other thing though is that sometimes we have data for these birds on wintering grounds and their numbers seem to be stable on wintering grounds, so then we can say, okay, it's either happening during migration or breeding. And there's some cases actually we're finding that during breeding season they're stable, but on wintering grounds they're not, so there's something happening. That's all I'm trying to figure out right now. So, oh my gosh, Dave, what's next? And then
You mentioned there were differences between your study and another organization's studies,
and another what?
and another organization's.
Yeah, it's a breeding bird survey.
What kind of factors would come into play into why there are these differences and what are those differences?
So, have any of you done ENVS before? It's a citizen science program. It's awesome. It's one of the biggest bird data sets we have. And you could do ENVS, breeding bird surveys. So you basically are given a route, you drive a road, and you do surveys on the side of the road. So that already makes it different because you're going to different habitats and you're staying on the road. So any road impacts there would be, you look at that. The other thing that makes ours different, so we're in specific habitats. And then our biologists are trained. And so there's a lot of birds that we're finding that aren't detectable in breeding bird surveys because people aren't trained to hear them or know what to listen for, know what to look for. And an ENVS is great, but there's just that big difference. And so it's a technicality issue. Like we go out into a habitat, we think there might be a belly flycatcher there. So they're like, all right, so is this for here or not? Let's think about that. And so there's that component that's missing in ENVS.
I was just wondering, with explanations for the decrease in flycatchers, but what about leaves in the water?
So, from what I can tell, loon issues tend to be lead sinkers because they're picking up on that stuff in the northern lakes. So do not use lead sinkers or lead shot. So there's lead poisoning going on. A lot of these birds are also migrating through the Great Lakes, and loons will dive down and pick up on stuff on the bottom besides fish. And there's heavy metal poisoning, and there's some other diseases. Like there's a big loon die-off last year in Imagery, I think. Spot poisoning. So there's stuff going on during the migration as well. Why the decrease? I think why the Breeding Bird Survey is seeing more of them is because more people are looking for them, to be quite honest. Like they're iconic species. Like, we're at a lake because they're living here. Does that help?
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's more out there.
Is there much data or long-term studies on like owls or other birds of prey in general?
So owls are a toughie because they're not during the day.
Right.
But there is a separate study, kind of like Breeding Bird Survey right now, that's looking at just northern owls. So we have the eruption going on right now with the, I don't know if you guys have followed this, but we have a huge snowy owl eruption going on. Right now, they're concentrated in the northeast of the northern states. And so with that, it's more telemetry work, and then playbacks in February and March when owls are most active, like breeding. But those are mostly citizen science studies, at least up in that part of the U.S. right now.
You mentioned the resident, I guess, insectivores that are maybe doing well because of earlier, or
Yeah.
like a coupling with that. Do you see any maybe migrant insectivores that are suffering because of that earlier onset insect
You guys know what genealogy is? So, okay. So that is actually, so my advisor, so my advisor and a bunch of the other grad students I've worked with them on here, and one of those grad students right now is looking at the arrival of migrants versus that emergence, and they're not clicking. So that's something else that's going to end up going into that model. Like plus people can actually bring in the migration stuff. Basically, the birds are arriving after the main source has already emerged. And then they're also thinking about competition because now we have the permanent residents that are competing because their nests are earlier, they need more food because they're young, and they're focused on insects because you get insects too young even if you're a seed eater. And then the rest of the migrants show up, and so that's understudied. I have another minute-ish?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, do you have any sort of information on predation, nesting birds, or something like that?
So, for lucky or not lucky or for better or for worse, in those areas, the boreal forests are pretty thick. And we do find that some nest predators are utilizing like ATV trails and roads. But it's mainly the ground nesters that we see nest predators for, and it's mainly red squirrel, fox. I feel like there's another one, but they may not be as profound of an impact as some of the other big scale things. Like it's more like localized, so you might have an Ovenbird population, maybe a ground nester, where you have a new logging road that comes in, that population doesn't survive, but the northern forests are a source population, and so we have Ovenbird elsewhere that could which we didn't later on. So that seems to be the case right now. Other questions? All right, thanks you guys. So the point of all this is for you guys to see that timing thing, and like the rushing is totally what happens in real life. Like you have someone with a sign, they're going to totally cut you off. And then just so you guys can see like the research that I guess your colleagues, so we're all working on, climate infiltrates it, even if we're not actually focused on the climate change. And then this is a way that we communicate with our colleagues in this sort of format where you get together, tell people what we're researching, what we're doing in the future, how can we collaborate, so on and so forth. At least that's ideal what happens. I think we should take a break.
I was thinking maybe we should talk about the assignment and then we break and you just get back and make discussion items. Does that seem
Do you want to?
Sure. Yeah. So I feel so much better than I did last week. I actually, you might be able to hear me. Let's see, I'll get one. And then if you guys could just kind of pass those backwards. This is the assignment that's going to be due on February 13th. And this is the climate change skeptic interview. And we wanted to give you a little bit more detail and start you thinking about it and planning for it early. So basically this assignment is to meet with someone who is self-defined as a climate change skeptic. We want you to have an interview with them, and we don't want it to be like a 15-minute interview. Why don't you believe in climate change? Okay, that's done, we're out of there. We're hoping you can have a discussion with them for 45 minutes to an hour. So we want you to have kind of a nuanced discussion, and what I've done is I've provided some sample questions that you could ask during this interview. So in the middle of the sheet, there's some sample questions here. And for this sort of a project, I don't want you guys to feel so structured that you can't have